Good to see everyone and have such a good number with us. Someone said it's always going to be good when Mr. Chad stands on the floor. I don't know about that, but it may mean that my sanguine side is bored with standing in the pulpit, or it may be that sometimes if my back is hurting, I don't want to try to climb the stairs. But this morning, I am going to do something a little bit different. I need Miss Corinne Stevenson and Miss Mackenzie Wheeler. Now, you may remember, it's been a little while ago, we looked at a sermon on the Bible and math. This was a request from Mackenzie. And so I want you guys to stand right here because I want to see if you recognize this. It says, "Dear Mr. Chad, all of us want to say what a good preacher you are. And we're going to all have a big talk with our teachers about math. So some of us want to know about science." And I mean, it's very well decorated. This is from Mackenzie, Noah, Costas, Corinne, Emma, Rachel, Skylar, Madison, Kendall, Kylie, Sarah, Isabella, Levi, Noah, Caleb, Hudson, Rhett, Addison, Axel, Samuel, and every teenager. Ashlyn, I got it in writing. You think I'm a good preacher. I'm teasing Ashlyn because we went at each other a little bit during the campaign. And my son also being a teenager. That's in writing. I'm glad you included Costas because we have a little bit of sketchy history there. But you girls, I underlined their names because they handed this to me. And they went to great lengths to, it looks very scientific. I can tell there's some stars, and I think there's an atom up there. And maybe a cell. I think I see a cell. So I'm going to get, you guys can go here like we did before. And any of you other young'uns that maybe you're wondering about science, or maybe you just don't like science and you're wondering, does the Bible have anything to say about that? We're going to give you your opportunity. You can come down here and you can join us and have a front row seat for this special lesson on the Bible. I know you want to come. Come on. I want you where I can have you in arm's reach while Mama's not here. Noah looked like he got in a tussle with a wolverine. He had a little bike or scooter accident yesterday. That's it. Nobody else? All right. I wanted to at least have my two guests of honor down here because they oh, here we go. Here comes Miss Sarah. They handed this to me. Come on down, Mr. Noah. And I apologize, ladies, for, and every teenager and the others, for taking so long this was a while back. But actually, when I got this question, I thought, wow, a lesson on science in the Bible. Math, we had to get a little creative. There's some other stuff we could have talked about with math, but you may recall in that lesson, we got a little creative. We talked about, God loves addition. He loves adding people to the church when they obey the gospel. He loves multiplication when the early church was multiplied there in the book of Acts. And God hates division, some of those things. But this one, the Bible is just replete with science. And so my delay was not in, well, what am I going to talk about? My delay was, what am I going to not talk about and not have, Jacob stand up and just walk out on me. I'm teasing Jacob, but there's so much that we could talk about with science in the Bible. So here's what I want to do. And we're going to talk about this today in sort of an overview fashion. We want to talk about it in overview fashion. And then what I want to do from there is on the first Sunday night of each month, for the next several months, I want to look at a more specific lesson. We're going to be more overview fashion this morning. Then I want to look at specifics. We may talk about geology. We may talk about astronomy, biology, some of those things, and how they relate to the Bible, how the Bible confirms these things. We're going to look at that the first Sunday night of each month. Some of you young folks, some of you older folks, there may be questions that come up. We will deal with any questions that come up with that. As always, you can put them in the box, email me, tell me in person, whatever works best. But I want to cover these things, with some some depth. I know we still won't be able to get as in depth as probably we would like, but at least cover these a little bit more. This is important because we're bombarded with the message today that science and the Bible are completely opposite. That science and faith are in opposition to one another. And they're not. Because the God who wrote the Bible is the God who gives us science. You don't have science without God. You just don't. And so I want us to understand that. And then as we go forward again, we're going to unpack some of these things. And I hope a lot of this is going to be based on, and as always, we'll tweak it some, but a lot of this is going to be based on a book by Wayne Jackson. A lot of our material this morning will be based on Brother Wayne Jackson's book, but he wrote an excellent book. Wayne, of course, he started and has been the director of Christian Courier for, I don't know how long, it's probably been 30 or 40 years now. But he wrote a book called The Bible and Science. I know there are at least, well, I think there are 2 copies in our library. But it is tremendous. And as I read this, I thought this needs to be preached and proclaimed from the mountaintop, so to speak. Because people have this misunderstanding about the Bible and science. They're in harmony. You don't have science without God, because there are these laws and there are these ways in which our universe operates in such precision that you can't have without an all-powerful being behind that, holding all things together. As Colossians 1 says, talking about Jesus, by him all things consist or hold together. And so, again, we're going to talk about it in kind of an overview fashion. We'll look at it on Sunday nights. I hope if you're not accustomed to coming on Sunday night, you'll come and check this out, because I think it's going to be a fascinating series. You'll have your faith strengthened. And it may be something that you already understand. It may be confirming faith. It may be strengthening faith. It may be correcting things. But we want to look at how the Bible and science work together, how they're in harmony. There's not disunity there. There's perfect harmony. So that being said, let's talk about this again in overview fashion this morning, and then we'll sort of go from there. But I appreciate these young folks because they encourage me tremendously, and I love that they're interested. I love the question about, I think I told you when we studied that lesson that one of the parents came and said, now, you just kind of ignore that. She doesn't like math, and she's kind of hoping that you'll stand up and say there's no math in the Bible or something. And so we kind of laughed about that. And I said, well, no, actually, I had sort of a sermon starter tucked away, and I never really fleshed it out. And, we've talked before about science in the Bible, but this kind of gives us occasion to really focus in on it. And I'm excited to do that. And especially love getting my notes from the children. There are certain people in the world that if they think you're all right, it doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. I'm happy. And so if these young folks think Mr. Chad is okay, then I don't care what other folks think. I tell people, if the people at Bremen like me and they're happy with me, then that's all I need. I appreciate that so much. So let's talk about this. What is science, first of all? Most of you probably have handouts. There may be some extras in the back. I forgot, again, to bring extras with me. But if you have a handout, this is our first point. What is science? You got to understand what science is, first of all, before you can talk about science in the Bible or science in anything. It comes from a Latin word. I'm not real good at pronouncing Latin. I think it's scientia, scientia. It just means knowledge. So we talk about science, we're talking, generally speaking, about knowledge. There's more to it than that, as we'll see in just a moment. But that's what the word literally means from Latin. If you want a sort of a textbook definition, I looked at Merriam-Webster. I looked at a couple others, but I found one from dictionary.com. Dictionary.com goes based off the American Heritage Dictionary. Here's their verbatim definition. Systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation or experimentation. That's kind of your fancy definition of science. We want to classify science for purposes of our study, and I realize that some of these things can get a lot more complicated. So some of this we're putting in terms of for the purpose of our study this morning, and even as we go on first Sunday nights. But there are classifications that we want to break it down. One of these is physical science. Physical science is going to deal with non-living things. When you think about physical science, you might think of astronomy, geology. Those are a couple of things that come to mind. Geology is going to study the earth, rocks, and so on. Archaeology could, in one sense, fall into that field. These are non-living things. Astronomy, planets. Well, planets aren't living, stars aren't living, and so on. So this would be the study of non-living things. Then you have, of course, biological science, which is the exact opposite. It's going to deal with living things, living material. This would be fields of study such as zoology. You have zoology, you have anatomy, physiology. These are different fields of study that would fall into the realm of biological science. Zoology is study of animals, anatomy, study of the body, physiology, study of systems and how those things work within living creatures and so on. And then you have another field, and this will be a field we probably won't deal with very much in this study, but you have to recognize it. It does count as science, and that is intellectual science. And what you're going to notice is that not all these fields of science can be studied exactly the same because some things are living, some things are not living. Some things are, again, intellectual science. What do we mean by that? A couple of examples. Well, the lesson that led to this study was a question dealing with math. Math is a science, right? It's an intellectual science. It's the study of the relationship between numbers. And so you have these equations and things like that, but it's a science. It's not the same as physical science. It's not the same as biological science, but it is a science. Logic. Logic also would be considered a science. Logic is the science of how to think properly. Because some people are very illogical, right? And you want to learn to think properly to draw conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. Well, all that's pertained in logic, the study of the science of thinking correctly. And so again, not all science can be studied in the same way. You can't study logic by testing, experimenting, hypotheses in the same way you would if you were dealing with rocks, you're studying rocks, or the human system or something like that. So, different. Those are the three classifications for the purpose of our study: physical, biological, intellectual. Now, I want to mention something here before we move on. This is not on the handout. I just didn't have room. The scientific method. We're all probably familiar with the scientific method. These young folks and the other young folks out there, you probably studied this in school. Maybe you had to memorize it. Sometimes people break it down into just 4 or 5 steps. Sometimes people have more like this. I don't know how well it actually looks. I forget the difference in the two projectors. I look at the projector in the back, and this one up here is so different. But, you can observe, you can ask a question or identify a problem. You can research, hypothesize, and formulating a hypothesis is just an idea. I think this might be the case. For instance, up here with a question, you may have someone who comes from the South, or not just the South, we might say like an equatorial region, very tropical climate. They've never been beyond that. And so one day they have occasion, or maybe they move to Minnesota in January. And maybe this particular person goes out and he sees a puddle of water. It has rained, and overnight he wakes up in the morning, comes out there, and this puddle of water now is, well, it's solid, and he can push on it, and it's not water. It's just getting his feet wet like before. It's solid. So the question may then become, where did it come from? What happened? Why did the water suddenly become this solid substance? Now that sounds pretty simple. I mean, we just know, but that's a good example, right? He may form a hypothesis. Okay, darkness. Darkness turns this water into this solid substance, and so he may test, and then maybe the weather gets a little warmer and it gets dark. But even in Minnesota, when it gets dark, it's warmer weather, that water is still water. Then he may form a hypothesis, wait a minute, it's a lot colder here than where I was living before. Perhaps it's something to do with the temperature. That might be his hypothesis. And then he begins to test it, and guess what? He finds out, That's exactly what's going on. It's a lot warmer where I used to live. And so we never had water just outside. Wake up and there it is. It's turned ice. Even though the weather gets cooler, it didn't get cold enough. And so you get the idea there. Again, that's a pretty simple illustration, but it illustrates the point. Just a couple of points about these things. When you talk about observation of facts, that's part of the scientific method. Observation. This involves the senses, right? You see, you hear, smell, taste. I had to stop and think there for a second. And touch, right? The five senses. So you got to observe. Now, I say all that to say this. Sometimes we get really hung up on science. It's just this like magical word. And sometimes people say, I believe in what I can see. Sometimes people will scoff at religion. They'll scoff at faith. And they'll say, I believe in what I can see. And that's why I believe in science. Hold on. Because there are some things that are just not subject to observation, to empirical analysis, such as God. We could say the same for angels. Do you believe in love? Do you believe in hate, compassion, pity, anger? Subject any of those to your five senses. You can't do it. Can you hear love? Can you smell it? Can you taste it? Can you see it? What about the soul? What about God? What about angels? You see, there's some things that are just not subject to the senses, but they're no less real. These things are provable. These things that are not subject to the senses, such as love, hate, any kind of emotion really would fit into that. God, angels, they're provable. They're not provable scientifically. They're provable logically, but not in a scientific way. Quote, scientific. See, what we need to understand is that sometimes people say, well, I only believe in what I can see. That's just not true. Even people that say that, they believe in emotions, but you can't see them. You can't subject them to testing, observation, analysis, and so on. And so understand that. I mentioned the statement of a problem, talking about the example of the fellow with seeing a puddle turn to ice. Then there's, of course, testing or experimentation. Someone has said that science without experimentation is just speculation. That's true. If something is going to be scientific, you've got to be able to experiment with it. Got to subject it to some testing. Keep that in mind for later on. And then, of course, if enough evidence supports a hypothesis, then it may become a theory. A theory. What is a theory? Well, that's a whole other subject, I suppose. But let me just say this. A theory doesn't prove anything. A theory is not proof. It just means there's enough evidence to test further. And again, bear that in mind when people talk about the theory of evolution. People sometimes talk about it as if it's some kind of a fact, as if it's some kind of a law. It's not. Someone decided there was enough evidence, they wanted to test it further. They gave it this name theory, and all of a sudden everybody's just so enamored with the theory of evolution. Darwin's theory of evolution. It doesn't prove anything. It's not proof of anything. And in fact, the evidence is there. We'll see, and that's getting into some of the more specific studies later on. The evidence is there that the theory doesn't hold up at all. And if there are enough facts, the facts may demonstrate the theory to be law, right? You begin to check and to study the facts, and the facts may demonstrate, hey, this is not just a theory, this is a law. You can take something with some mass and some weight, and you can hold it up in the air and drop it, and what happens? Does it float? Does it float? It's not going to float. What's going to happen? It's going to fall, right? Why? There's a law, a scientific law, and it's called gravity. Every single time. There's no chance, ever, surely not now, that I will jump one day and reach Michael Jordan heights and be dunking on a basketball goal. gravity, genetics, and a lot of other things too. But, there's no chance that somebody's going to jump and suddenly just take off soaring because of the law of gravity. Now, when you begin to study aerodynamics, things like that, you learn ways that we can overcome, but the law of gravity is still there. And so if there's enough testing done, the facts may warrant, hey, this thing's not just a theory, it's a law. But let's talk next about some limitations of science. People get so enamored with science. And sometimes they're so in love with science. People say, oh, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. I've heard that statement made a lot. Whether it be, documentaries or some YouTube video. I can't recall if I've ever had anybody actually say that to me, but I've heard it said a number of times. People saying, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. But we need to understand there are some limitations of science. When you're talking God, there are no limitations. But there are some limitations with science. For one thing, physical and biological sciences, they're limited to sense, perception. We mentioned this just a moment ago. They're subject to empirical analyses. What can I see, smell, hear, taste, touch? To be able to, at least specifically with these physical and biological sciences, I've got to be able to analyze it empirically. Science also deals with the present, which again makes sense because our senses operate in the present. Can you smell the past? Can you taste the past? Can you taste the future? Can you see the future? Some people think, but you understand. And sometimes we use those terms figuratively. Sometimes we say we hear God and we study His Word. We're hearing God speak to us. But that's not in the sense of your sense of hearing. That's a figurative use. Sometimes we say we see God in nature. That's a figurative use. We're not literally seeing God with our eyes. So science deals with the present because our senses operate in the present. It's also interesting that science is limited to explaining how and not why. For instance, a man is shot and he dies. Forensics, maybe the medical examiner, the coroner, does this autopsy and he says, well, I can tell you exactly what happened. The bullet entered right here in his chest. It passed through his heart, exit out the back. He bled out and was dead within just a very short period of time. He can tell you, exactly. He can tell you the time of death. All these different things they can tell you. And so then the policeman says, interesting. Was it murder? Or was it an accident? And the forensic says, well, let me do my... No. You know what the forensic scientist says at that point? I can't tell you that. That's your job. All I can tell you is, here's how the man died. The bullet passed through his body. Maybe it severed an artery or something like that, and he bled out. Here's a man, maybe he had a heart attack. But was it caused by a drug or something like that? Did somebody intentionally do this? Did he mistakenly ingest a drug? Did somebody poison him? You see, science can tell you how, but it can't tell you why. Going right with that, there's another limitation of science. Science is amoral. Let me pause right there. I didn't say science is immoral. That's a different word. Immoral means somebody who has no morality or goes against a moral code. Amoral just means without morals. It's different. What does it mean when we say science is amoral? Well, one of the things that science has given to us in relatively recent history is nuclear energy, right? Nuclear energy. We can split the atom and do amazing things. What are we going to use nuclear energy for? Are we going to use it to destroy cancer? Or are we going to use it to destroy cities? Or are we going to fight cancer, or are we going to fight one another with nuclear power? Science can't tell you that. Science cannot answer that question. You need morals. You got to have a code of morals to answer that. And what if in one country they say, no, we're going to use nuclear energy to kill people and to dominate the world? And somebody over here says, no, that's wrong. use nuclear power to do good and to fight cancer and to all the other good things that we can do with it. And the person over here says, you say it's wrong. It's right to us, though. We're going to use it. We're going to rule the world. Who's right in that situation? The one who says it's morally wrong or the one who says, no, there's nothing morally wrong with it. We think it's okay. We're going to do it. We're kind of find ourselves in a, it's not exactly parallel, but similar situation right now with some of the world current events in world history. So who's right? One says one thing, one says the other. You see, you got to have a moral code. There has to be a universal standard. Now, again, that's another lesson for when we get more specific in our study. But you see the idea of science, it's amoral. It can't answer that question. How are we going to use this discovery? Are we going to use it to hurt people or to help people? Both. Which is it going to be? Science can't tell us that because it's amoral. Not only that, science deals with matter. It deals with matter. And we touched on this a moment ago, but science can't deal with love. It can't deal with the soul. People have done, and it's amazing what our government and people in general will waste money on. They have spent, I don't even know, it's probably millions. I didn't go and try to put a figure on it, but people have spent so much time and money and effort and energy with these precision scales that they have a patient who is near death. And they put them on this bed. You know why? When the soul leaves the body, we want to know how much does a soul weigh. And you know what they found out? Nothing. They didn't find out a thing. You know why? I mean, it's not because their scales weren't precise enough or weren't sensitive enough to test that just, tiny little fraction of a pound or kilogram. It's because you can't subject a soul to empirical analysis. How much does love weigh? When you give someone all the love you've got in your being, do you lose 10 pounds? Would be a lot more love in the world, right? You don't lose weight when you give love away. You don't gain weight when you hoard up a lot of bitterness in your soul. It'll damage you. It'll hurt you for sure, but not in that sense. Because these things aren't subject to empirical analysis. Science deals with matter. And then finally, there's a limitation in that science deals with things that are repeatable. Science deals with things that are repeatable. Bear that in mind. Because the next thing I want to notice here is, we're kind of asking what's the point of all this, talking about these limitations of science. Did life begin with a big bang? Did life come from nothing? I'm hearing some no's up here. Good. Correct. But some people say life began with a big bang. Some people say it came from nothing. Has anybody ever seen that happen? Has anybody ever observed it? Have we ever once observed life come from nothing? Or a big bang, or a little bang for that matter, that created life? No. I mean, you guys got it. Nobody's ever seen that happen. Has it been repeated? Has it been verified? No. Oh, but Chad, we have such an old earth. I mean, wait, time out. What does a young earth look like? If we had a young earth over here, we could compare them and say, here's a young earth, but how many earths do we have? Just one. Just one earth. So what does a young earth look like compared to an old? Oh, but there are these layers and there's this appearance of age. Okay, well, there could be an appearance of age. Oh, it's years and years of erosion. Or a massive worldwide event that took place that did more to make the earth appear old in the terms of erosion and things like that than thousands and thousands and thousands of years would have done at the current state, at a steady state, which makes more sense, which is more in harmony with science as we know it. And lastly, let's just say this before we move on. Science, quote, science, now true science is in harmony with the Bible, but so-called science has kind of a sketchy past, doesn't it? I mean, It was a long time ago, but there was a time when science was really hard at work to figure out how they could just take ordinary objects and turn them into gold. Alchemy. I mean, wouldn't that be awesome? How'd that work out? Oh, yeah, you can't do that. Doesn't work that way. What about vestigial organs? Oh, see, these are left over from our evolutionary ancestors. You have these organs that you don't need them. They're just leftovers from evolution. Wait a minute. A little bit more research, we find out, yeah, those actually serve a purpose. Now, sometimes you can live without them, such as your appendix. That doesn't mean it's useless. That doesn't mean it's just leftovers. No, they all have a purpose. It was science some time ago that told us the earth is just flat, and if you sail too far, Columbus, you're just going to fall off the earth. It was science also at one time that said the earth was supported by pillars. Science at one time, it was one of the Greek philosophers, I want to say Aristotle, might have been Plato, that said man's brain is composed of earth. That was wrong. You see, there's just things that science has told us. Oh, I had he was a Christian, a member of the body of Christ. When I traveled with some buddies from college to help this one friend of mine move out to California for grad school. And three of us went out there to kind of help him. Stopped at every possible site we could think of on the way out there, just every possible free site. We were in college to just kind of make it into a big road trip. Well, one of the sites we stopped at was the Grand Canyon. And I saw something on a sign talking about millions of years, the Colorado River flowing millions of years through the Grand Canyon, carving this gorge. And I scoffed at it. And one of my buddies, he scoffed at me. And I said, whoa, time out, because I'm thinking I'm talking to a Christian here. He ought to know better than this. I said, you think this was millions of years? He said, yeah. I said, don't you believe the Bible? And he said, well, I mean, come on. How do you think it happened? And I said, I don't know. What might carve something like that, cause up such a massive gorge? Maybe a global flood. And he kind of scoffed at me and he said, Chad, I just graduated with an engineering degree. I think I know what would cause a great gorge in the earth. And you know, and I gave it back to him a little bit. I said, well, pardon me to question an engineer. I just have common sense. That's all I got going for me. But hey, sometimes that'll take you far. And you know what? That was in 2000, 2001. You know what scientists more and more are saying now? They're really backing off this millions of years, the Colorado River thing. You know what they're saying? Hey, we don't know what happened, but it does not appear that the Grand Canyon was carved over millions of years. What seems to have happened is some kind of a traumatic, catastrophic event. Now, I mean, we don't know. We don't know what that could be. But this catastrophic event happened, and here we are with the Grand Canyon. And every Bible-believing person is going, hello, catastrophic event, tried the flood. But sometimes there's this bias, and people just, it's right in front of their face, and they still don't want to see it. We have an expression, you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes that's what happens. You know, science, it has a little bit of a sketchy past. Let's just don't forget that, okay? And then finally, let's talk about, is the Bible scientifically credible? Look, the Bible's not a textbook of science, all right? I had a guy tell me that one time. He was trying to push the idea that, I'm still a Christian, I still believe in the Bible, but it's clear man evolved. God just must have created the raw material and then let evolution take over. But what about Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and other passages we can talk about, but specifically Genesis 1 and 2? And he says, look, dude, the Bible's not a textbook of science, okay? You're taking that way too literally. What is there? What else? How else do you take? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And the evening and the morning were the second day. I don't know how else to take that, folks. Evening, morning, I mean, that's a 24-hour period. We get so hung up, though, on science. I got to make it harmonize with science. And we forget that, again, science sometimes and quite often has been wrong about things, only to discover later on that the true science, well, we didn't have it at that time. Now we're learning. We're growing in our understanding. It's not a science textbook, folks. I get that. But a book that is inspired of God, infallible when it touches on science, even incidentally. I can expect it to be accurate. If it's not, well, if it's wrong about that scientific statement, maybe it's wrong about salvation. Maybe it's wrong about worship. And that's what some people want to do. They're really ultimately chipping away at the foundation of faith, chipping away at the foundation of the Bible as being God's inspired word. But the Bible's accurate. Now, people will make accusations, but that doesn't make it so. So what makes the Bible scientifically credible? Real quickly. What makes the Bible scientifically credible? Number one, it's scientific precision. There's precision, scientific precision. You know, you have these science books. You guys have your science books at school. I could take science books from when I was in school. Jake and I, we went to school together. I bet you couldn't even find them. They don't sell them anymore. Why? One thing, you know, we're getting old. But, you know, a lot of old books are still around. But they're obsolete. In a few years, they're obsolete. What about the Bible? I mean, you're talking 2,000 years going, folks. It's still here. It's not going anywhere. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven, Psalm 119:89. What other book can say that? Science books go obsolete so quickly. You know, science once thought that the universe was eternal. Matter was eternal. Created itself out of nothing. That's part of that sketchy history of science. But, you know, the Bible has said all along, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And Genesis 2:1-2 says, the heavens, the earth, all the host of them were finished. God rested on the seventh day. Now, did he rest because he was tired, so worn out from all that creation? It's hard work, right? Y'all are saying no. Why? Why no? What does it mean? God rested means he finished. He finished his work of creation. He ceased. That's what the word means in the Hebrew. And we have these laws. Again, these are scientific laws. They're called the laws of thermodynamics. And one of those laws, the first law, is also called the law of the conservation of energy. And it says matter can neither be created nor destroyed. You could change it from one state to another. You burn a log and you haven't destroyed matter, even though you in a few hours, maybe you come and it's just gone. Well, some of it went up in smoke. Some of it was given off as heat, energy. And some of it is there, ashes. But you didn't destroy it. You just changed its state. That's consistent with what the Bible has said. God made everything, and then he ceased creating. So you can't create matter now. No one can. The second law of thermodynamics is called also the law of increasing entropy. It means everything is kind of winding down, for lack of a better term. But if it's winding down, guess what happened at some point in the far distant past? Somebody had to wind it up. We think of a clock, right? And if a clock is winding down, then guess what happened to it at some point? Somebody wound it up. The Bible had this all along, folks. Science used to think matter was eternal, that the universe was eternal. They could have gone to their Bible and they'd have saved themselves a lot of time, several years figuring this out. You know, as recently as World War II, they segregated blood. Blacks, whites, and other ethnicities and other nationalities. They segregated blood. And it was right there in Genesis, Acts 17:26 all along. He is made of one. Now, the King James says of one blood, but the manuscript evidence shows it's literally out of one male. He made everyone. The unity of humanity. There's no black blood. There's no Chinese person's blood. There's no white man's blood. You know, in fact, some of this drove Hitler's idea of a superior race. But we're made out of, it is one blood, but from one human. We all came from Adam. And the Bible had that all along. On and on we could go, and we'll touch on some more of these as we go through this study. Also, another reason that the Bible is scientifically credible, the alleged inaccuracies and discrepancies, they're always disproven, always. You know, the Bible has withstood the test of time. And again, I'll remind you, it's one thing to make an accusation. It's another thing to prove it. You know, oh, the Bible's full of errors. And sometimes people hear that and they go, oh, yeah, well, hey, saying that doesn't make it so. I declare myself king of the world or president of the United States. That doesn't make it so. And again, I'll remind you also, it sometimes takes just a second to make an accusation, but sometimes you've got to do some serious research to disprove it. And then third, the Bible is scientifically credible because false science is not included in the Bible. There's a lot of ancient Egyptian medicine that you would expect Moses. Acts 7:22 tells us he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. You would expect him to use some Egyptian advice and medicine when he's talking and writing the Pentateuch and giving instruction to God's people. He doesn't do that. You don't find any of the Egyptian superstitions. There was one, I was looking, I thought I had put it in my Bible, the note, but I guess I left it sitting on my desk. But there was one, it was an Egyptian medicine, like a code of medicine. When you're losing your hair, and it says when it falls out, you take fat from 5 different animals. The crocodile, the cat, the ibex, and there were 2 others I can't remember. But you take the fat from these animals. You take the bone of something, I think it's the bone of a donkey, you crush it, mix it in with that fat and rub it all around. That'll take care of your hair loss. You believe that? Why didn't Moses say things like that? There are all kinds of things like that. There's superstitious stuff in ancient Egyptian literature. Why didn't Moses try something to tell people to do something like that? Just the sanitation regulations alone in the Pentateuch are so far ahead of their time. And we'll talk again more about this when we get to it on our Sunday night study. You cannot explain that except Moses. He's not using Egyptian wisdom. He's using heavenly wisdom because it's being revealed to him by God Almighty. Folks, what we need to understand is the God who wrote the Bible is the God who made science. They're one and the same. You don't have science without God. And so that's the God that we're going to stand before one day. When you think about these things, and I've mentioned before, Bob and I were able to go down last year to West Georgia. It unfortunately fell during Yes Weekend. But to hear this brother who's worked extensively with NASA, I think he still does on a contract basis, and to hear him talking, the more you learn about science and the more you learn about our universe, the more it just screams, there is a God. And if there's a God, I'm going to stand before him one day and I'm going to give an account. We all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ, 2 Corinthians 5:10, and give an account for the things that we've done, whether they're good or bad. Ecclesiastes 12:13 and 14 tells us the same thing. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. I realize a lot of what we've talked about this morning has not been, about how to become a Christian, how to obey God, and to get your life right with God. But as we extend heaven's invitation, it may be that you seeing the harmony between God and science, you say, you know what, I want to know more about God. I want to know more about how to please him. We want to take that time. We want to study with you and look more. And I know we haven't touched on a lot of verses in this particular study because we're looking at it from a standpoint of helping people to understand. Sometimes, people say, well, how do I know the Bible is from God? And sometimes our response is, well, because the Bible says so. But you see, that's circular reasoning. We want to make sure we use good, sound logic, and that's that science of proper thinking when we talk about this. As we go through, though, we'll use more verses. We'll look at things more in depth and see how the Bible, or science rather, confirms the Bible over and over and over. Maybe you need to know more about God. Maybe as a child of God, you need to come back to him. Maybe we can help you to learn more about how to please him, how to become his child. We want to do that. Won't you come as we stand and sing?